In this video, we're going to talk about the 4 phases of an OWI traffic stop. There are 4 key parts of a traffic stop that it's important to understand to know, was everything done correctly in these 4 stages. It covers everything from when the officer first observes you through field sobriety testing to ultimate blood testing or other certified breath tests. So we're going to talk about that so you can have a deep understanding of all the different parts of an OWI traffic stop. So about me, my name's Nathan Vining. I'm a criminal defense attorney here in Indiana, and I've represented people across the state of Indiana through all different phases of an OWI case, and we're going to talk about that here today. What we're going to do is follow along with a document known as the OWI probable cause affidavit. And this is a standard form in Indiana that an officer will fill out as a part of an OWI case. And what we're going to do is look at the different sections of it, which essentially break down the different 4 phases of an OWI. So what we're going to do first is look at phase 1. And phase 1 involves the vehicle in motion. So ultimately, you're driving around somewhere and an officer makes an observation. They observe somebody driving that essentially raises their suspicion, and it causes them to look at things a little more closely. And what they're going to be looking at are things like suspicious driving behaviors. They're going to be looking at weaving across lanes, weaving over lines. They're going to be looking at jerky motions, wide turns, or turns not making sense, things like that. So ultimately, the officer's trained to look at several different things while the vehicle's in motion. And this is important because an officer just can't pull you over for anything. Ultimately, the officer has to have reasonable suspicion that there's some criminal activity or infraction that's occurring. And that's going to need to be supported by specific and articulable facts that the officer's going to have to list out as the justification for why they stopped you. And ultimately, even if you're stopped for an infraction, that's not necessarily enough to know that you are intoxicated. So ultimately, when there's a traffic stop, there has to be something more for them to believe that there's intoxication and for them to go forward and do additional testing. What they do in phase 1 is look at these driving cues, things like attempting to flee if the officer puts on their emergency lights and you don't stop. They're going to look at, do you have a slow reaction to when their lights go on? They're going to look to slow responses at traffic signals. So for instance, if you're at a red light and it turns green and you're sitting there waiting for a while, they're going to be looking at if you're driving off the road, abrupt turns. They're going to be looking at things that would make you appear impaired, even driving into opposing traffic or making illegal turns, things like that. So they're going to be looking at these driving cues during phase 1. And then also, and we touched upon this briefly, but they're looking also to your reaction of the officer. So when the lights go on, do you weave across lanes, things like that. And this is the part of the probable cause affidavit that really outlines phase 1 of an OWI traffic stop. And here you can see what the officer their options are to check off. And ultimately, they observed the accused operate the vehicle in their presence. They would write down what traffic violations they believe they occurred. They're going to indicate if there's a crash or anything like that. So ultimately, in this section of the probable cause affidavit, what the officer does is list out what they observed and were there any erratic or specific driving things that caused them concern. As an attorney, phase 1 is a very important part of a traffic stop. And this is one of the areas where you can go and see if there's ways you can challenge a case. Because ultimately, if the officer messed up in phase 1 and they pulled you over without a specific reason that you were either violating some infraction or there was some kind of criminal activity, then there could be grounds for a motion to suppress. So one of the first things that an attorney would look at in an OWI case is how can you challenge a traffic stop? Because ultimately, if there's no reason to pull you over, there'd be no reason to discover that there was a person operating while intoxicated. So that is really one of the big important things of phase 1. Next, we're going to talk about phase 2. And in phase 2 of an OWI traffic stop involves contact with the officer. So when the officer approaches a vehicle and makes contact with the driver, they are there assessing what is going on. They're looking first for their personal safety and what's happening with the stop. They're also looking at what criminal activity may be occurring. There's so many probable cause affidavits that we would read where you can see people shuffling around a car, hiding things. Officers are observing from the moment they approach the car, and they're looking in the vehicle to see if there's evidence of other crimes or other things that may be suspicious. So what the officer does is they look at what they see, what they hear, and what they smell here. So a lot of times in an OWI traffic stop, the officer will begin to ask questions, ask about your day, where you're coming from, things like that. They're going to be looking for signs of odors. One of the big things in a traffic stop like this is the officer smelled alcohol, and they're going to indicate that in their report. And then they're going to be looking at how you are reacting. Are you slow to respond? Is there slurred speech? Are you unable to follow directions? Are you uncoordinated when you're reaching for things like your license or registration? They're going to be looking at your appearance. Do you have bloodshot eyes? Are you disheveled? Things like that. So ultimately, phase 2 involves contact with the officer, and there's a lot to it and a lot of things that they may see, hear, or smell that they would include in a report. And when we go to the OWI probable cause affidavit, here is the next section that's really important. And there's a section for observations, and there's a lot of things that the officer may check that they observe, things like odor of alcoholic beverage, alcohol beverage containers in view, speech was slurred, sometimes they may say repetitive or fast, eyes were bloodshot and glassy, manual dexterity was poor, abusive attitude, they could list something out, they could list something about their balance, they could indicate things about soiled or disordered clothing. They could also observe things like failing to shut off the vehicle, having trouble with the window, leaving the vehicle in gear. They could also make observations about just your presence in front of them. Were you unbalanced or staggering or leaning against the vehicle? Ultimately, the observations are very broad, and if you are charged with an OWI, there's going to be some observations that the officer listed, which is the reason they believe you were intoxicated. Because this is, again, another part of one of those traffic stops where if the officer didn't have reason to believe you were intoxicated, then why would they ultimately do a field sobriety test or a portable breath test or a blood test? So you would want to make sure that if you ended up doing those things, that the officer had specific observations that led them to believe you were intoxicated. Otherwise, you may move to suppress the evidence that would be resulted from that subsequent investigation. So if you are stopped, there are specific things you should do. First, you should ask the officer, why did you stop me? Then they're going to be trying to figure out where you were going or what you were doing. A lot of times people are brutally honest and they'll say, I was coming from a bar, I had 2 or 3 drinks, and they'll be very specific. But ultimately, you should not discuss your day with the officer. They're not there to be your friend. They are there to investigate criminal activity, and you have a right to an attorney if you are going to be speaking with an officer. So you're going to want to say, why did you stop me? Figure out what the reason for the stop was. Indicate that you don't want to discuss your day with them. Then you're going to want to ask, are you detained or are you free to go? Because you want to determine, are they going to be issuing you a ticket and detaining you for a short period of time so they can do so? Or is there nothing that they found as a result of that stop, and are you free to go? And then if they want to talk to you further, you should invoke the Fifth and not speak further to the officer without your attorney present. Ultimately, that's phase 2. Next is phase 3, which are field sobriety tests. And there's 4 main tests used in Indiana. There's the horizontal gaze, the one-leg stand at the walk and turn, and the Romberg balance test. Now, ultimately, these field sobriety tests are important because they give the officer evidence as to whether or not a person's intoxicated. So you're going to want to look to, was the officer trained on the test? Did they do them correctly? Were there any other extraneous issues that could lead to the test being unreliable? Because ultimately, if there's issues with the test, there could be issues with the finding that they believe you were intoxicated, and that could lead to suppression issues. What it means is if you can suppress the field sobriety test, then you go suppress the subsequent investigation or any blood test or certified breath test that was a result. So again, with the probable cause affidavit, there is a specific section for the observations of the field sobriety test. And here you can see that HGN, the horizontal gaze, walk and turn, one-leg stand, and Romberg balance. So the officer is going to indicate what their observations are. And it's important to know, if you are asked to do these tests, you should let the officer know if you have any medication, any injuries, or you were in an accident that could impact the test. And want to pay specific attention to how to perform these tests because it can help your defense. So looking at the first test, the horizontal gaze test is the test where the officer will move something in front of your eyes horizontally. And what they're doing is looking for, at the extent, involuntary jerking. When the officer does this, when there is that jerking, it can indicate that there is intoxication present. And ultimately, the officer has to check both eyes twice for the cue, and he has to administer the test exactly as they're taught using proper instructions. You're looking at whether this was done right. You're going to want to note how close was the object in relation to your eye, and was it held at eye level, because if it's held too high or too low or too close, there could be issues with how the officer performed the test. The next test is the walk and turn test, and that is a test of walking and balance. It's basically where you would place your left foot on the line and take heel to toe, then turn around and do it back, and the officer is going to be looking for you keeping balance, listening to instructions. He's going to observe if you started before the instructions started, to see if you stopped, not touching heel to toe, stepping off the line, using your arms to balance. Things like that are all cues that the officer would use to determine if you pass or fail the test. And the test is only valid if it's properly administered, and any deviation would compromise the validity of the test. So, talk about that with your attorney. The next is the one-leg stand, and that's where a person would stand on one foot with their arms at their sides for 30 seconds and ultimately not sway or hop during the test. And you're going to want to look to see if that's done on dry or level surfaces. You're going to want to look at the age of the bird. Are there any shoes that could impact the results of this? Things like that with the one-leg stand. And then the Romberg balance test, and that's ultimately going to be used to determine if they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And you're going to want to look again, like test the surface it was done on, the age of the driver, shoes impacting the results of the test, things like that. Now the next phase is phase 4, and that's chemical test, and that's portable breath test, which can give a quick estimate on the of the blood alcohol content, but it's not admissible. And ultimately, if there's a positive reading on the PBT, the court's going to have you do a data master, which is a certified breath test station, or a blood test to confirm. So there is, again, a specific portion of the probable cause affidavit that covers the chemical test, and here is that section. And it talks about, do they read the implied consent law, because there could be implications if you refuse to submit to the breath test or chemical test that could result in license suspensions. And then there's sections to include the results of the test. And ultimately, if they do the portable breath test, this is a test that's used to confirm the results of the field sobriety test. They are not admissible in court, but they would allow the officer to then request that you take the next step and do the certified breath test or a blood test. So the chemical test, it's either done through a data master, which is a machine at the station that you would blow into, which is more reliable than a portable breath test, or through a blood test where there's a blood draw done and that blood sample is then analyzed. So if you are arrested for an OWI, there's a few things you should do. You should first write down the details of what happened the evening of the stop, everything you know. Write down the details of the traffic stop, what the officer told you, what you told the officer, as well as your recollection of how the field sobriety tests were performed. And you're going to want to write down what was requested of you by the officer. So getting those details down are important to review with your attorney. And if you are ultimately charged with an OWI, there's a lot of different outcomes. There are options for pretrial diversions depending on where you are at in the state. You also could negotiate reduction to something like reckless driving, or there's also options to plead to the OWI arrest, and that would ultimately be an agreement where you would reach with the state in terms of what would happen with the guilty plea. You also can obtain a dismissal. You can receive an acquittal at trial or a conviction at trial. So there's a lot of potential outcomes. Really depends on the facts of the case and what occurred in your situation. And if you do end up with a plea agreement, this is a sample OWI plea. This would be to the C misdemeanor OWI. Essentially, this one calls for 60 days with probation. There's a lot of standard things that are included in an OWI plea. For instance, substance abuse treatment, which is required as a part of all pleas, as well as the AID, destructive decision panel. So that's basically just a sample OWI plea. So if you have questions about an OWI case and you want to talk about it with somebody, review what occurred in your situation, feel free to give me a call or text me. I'd be happy to talk.